The first time I saw Ella Cartwright, she was seated in a leather chair at the far end of the precinct's therapy room. 14 years old. Brown eyes like storm clouds before the thunder. She stared at the floor with a kind of intensity that told me she saw more than she let on. But she didn't speak. She hadn't said a single word since the night her stepfather, Greg Holloway, was found dead at the bottom of their staircase, neck broken, eyes wide open, one slipper still halfway on. According to her mother, Angela, Ella had been asleep. According to the housekeeper, she'd heard nothing. And according to Ella? Well, she couldn't talk. Not anymore. Her selective mutism had begun months before the incident, after a series of panic attacks the school had written off as teenage anxiety. But after Greg's death, the silence calcified. Solid. Unshakable. And I've seen enough of these cases to know, when a child goes mute, something's being buried alive. The file I was handed was thinner than it should have been. The coroner's report labeled it an accidental fall. No signs of struggle. No forced entry. No toxins in his system. But something didn't sit right with me. There was no reason for Greg to be walking around in the middle of the night, especially not after the pain meds he was on post-surgery. And yet, there he was, dead on the floor, his face frozen in surprise. Angela was a wreck. At least, that's what she wanted everyone to believe. She cried in all the right places, kept her voice soft and trembling in every interview. But there was something rehearsed about her sadness. Ella, on the other hand, was unreadable. Her fingers were always fidgeting. Her eyes darted when someone walked behind her. And when the therapist showed her a simple inkblot image and asked what she saw, Ella pushed the paper away and tapped her thumb twice on her thigh. It was subtle, but it was a code, a pattern, a message. I'd seen it before in children of trauma. Sometimes silence wasn't absence. It was strategy. When I spoke with her alone, just the two of us and a tape recorder running quietly between us, I didn't ask her to talk. I just sat across from her and started telling her about another case. A girl just like her, who saw something too awful to describe. Who kept quiet because she didn't think anyone would believe her. I didn't name names, but Ella's eyes shifted. She was listening. I watched her take the pencil on the desk and begin to draw. Not a picture, but dots and dashes. Morse code. The girl wasn't just silent. She was speaking in a language no one had bothered to listen for. She spelled out one word. LIAR. That was when the hairs on my arms rose. Greg Holloway didn't fall. He didn't trip. Something or someone made sure he never got back up. And the only person who knew the truth was the one who hadn't spoken a word since. There was a reason Ella was afraid. And I was about to find out why. Because silence, in my line of work, is never empty. It's a scream with the volume turned down. The next time I visited the Cartwright house, I didn't ring the bell. I stood across the street, just observing. A home can say a lot without a single word. The curtains were drawn tight. Lights off in the upper hallway even though dusk had settled. Most families leave a light on for comfort. But this house? It wore darkness like a second skin. Ella's mother, Angela, was in the kitchen. I watched her through the open window, hands shaking as she poured herself another glass of wine, even though the bottle was already half gone. Inside that glass, I saw grief. But inside her eyes, guilt. I'd seen it too many times before. Angela wasn't mourning a husband. She was terrified of something else unraveling. Back at the station, I reviewed the evidence again. The carpet on the stairs was worn, but no loose fibers. No blood splatter. No defensive bruises on Greg's body. Just the fall. Clean and sudden. Too clean. Then I remembered Ella's Morse code message, liar. She hadn't said who. But the next day, she handed her therapist another note, this one folded tightly into 4 neat squares. It was a sketch. A staircase. A slipper. A stick figure at the top. Another at the bottom, with X's for eyes. And off to the side, written in small shaky handwriting. He shouldn't have come in my room. My breath caught. Suddenly, the silence wasn't mysterious. It was protective. Ella wasn't hiding a secret. She was surviving it. I brought the note to forensics. There were fingerprints, hers of course, but also smudged traces of someone else's. Faint. Adult-sized. Partial match to Angela. Why was Angela touching her daughter's notes? That same evening, I interviewed the housekeeper, Mrs. DeWitt, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had worked for the family for over 10 years. She'd seen Greg's body that night. She said the sound of his fall was what woke her. But when I asked if she saw anyone else in the hallway, her eyes twitched. No, she said too quickly. Just Ella standing at the top of the stairs. Blink. Frozen. Like she didn't even realize what happened. But she hesitated on the word just. Ella had been at the top of the stairs. But she hadn't been alone. Back in my office, I replayed the 911 call. It was Angela's voice. Please, my husband, he fell. He's not breathing. Ella saw the whole thing. I don't know what happened. Please hurry. Right there. That sentence. Ella saw the whole thing. But when questioned later, Angela claimed Ella had been asleep. If you're trying to protect your daughter, why tell dispatch she witnessed a death? Unless you're setting the stage, framing the story, and possibly framing your daughter. That night, Ella drew again. Another stick figure. This time, a larger one towering over a smaller one. The small figure had a red dot drawn over its mouth. Silenced. Underneath it, one word. Again. She was remembering. Not just that night, but many before it. Something terrible had been happening in that house. Something her silence screamed louder than words ever could. I sat in my car outside Ella's school the next morning, watching as other kids ran and played, laughed, and shoved backpacks. Ella moved differently. Eyes always scanning. Shoulders tight. Not a teenager. A soldier in a battlefield of memories. Her silence wasn't guilt. It was armor. And someone was trying to rip it off her. But they'd have to go through me first. By the third week, the storm brewing beneath that quiet home was no longer a secret. It had a scent. You could smell it when you walked in like old fear soaked into the walls. Ella had stopped drawing. Stopped writing. She sat through therapy sessions like a ghost, lips pressed together, knuckles white. Whatever she was holding back, it was closing in. I requested a court order for Ella's past medical and therapy records. Her mother objected immediately. Said it would traumatize her daughter. But I'd seen too many cases where trauma didn't come from exposure. It came from silence. The records were thin. Too thin. One report from a school counselor noted Ella's sudden shift in behavior at age 12. Withdrawn. Nightmares. Frequent stomach pain. But no follow-up. Then something caught my eye. A therapist's note, barely a line long. Patient reluctant to speak. Refers to night visits, but refuses to elaborate. I circled the phrase so hard my pen tore the page. I called Angela back to the station. This time, she came in without a lawyer. Maybe she thought she could charm her way out. Maybe she thought no one would believe a mute girl over her. What really happened that night? I asked her directly. Angela crossed her arms, lifted her chin. Greg fell. It was tragic. Ella says he came into her room. Her eyes narrowed. She writes that? She hasn't said a word in years. She doesn't have to speak to tell the truth. Angela paused. Then she leaned forward and lowered her voice. You want to know the truth, detective? Ella had problems. She was obsessed with Greg. She used to sneak into our room at night and just stand there, watching him, watching us sleep. Sometimes she'd even. I stopped her right there. Abusers always twist the story. Always make the victim sound unstable, dangerous, confused. I'd heard it 100 times. But Ella wasn't unstable. She was terrified. Later that day, I returned to the house unannounced. I had a feeling Mrs. DeWitt, the housekeeper, was sitting on something. She was folding laundry in the living room, trying to act calm. But when I mentioned Ella's drawings, her eyes dropped. "She doesn't draw anymore," she said softly. "After what happened to that one sketch." "What sketch?" Mrs. DeWitt hesitated. "The one she left on the kitchen table." It showed her closet. Someone inside it. With a belt. A belt. Greg had been found wearing pajama bottoms and no belt. But a leather belt had been part of the original wardrobe list taken from his side of the closet. It was missing. I returned to Ella's room. I searched every inch beneath the mattress, behind the bookshelf, under the floorboard paneling. And there, taped under the bottom drawer of her dresser, I found it. The belt. Wrapped tightly. Cleaned, but not completely. Faint stains. Blood. Ella's blood. A lab test confirmed it. I stared at it in an evidence bag for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because I knew what it meant. Ella hadn't just seen her stepfather fall. She had survived him. The next day, Ella passed me a note during our quiet session. 5 words. "Do you believe me now?" I looked her in the eyes. Deep brown. No tears. Just tired. "Yes," I said. "And I'm not going anywhere. I've spent years staring down suspects who lie through their teeth, corporate men, jealous lovers, even mothers who poison their own children. But Ella? She didn't lie. She just carried a secret so heavy it bent her spine. After I confirmed the belt belonged to Greg and had traces of Ella's blood, I requested a court-appointed child psychiatrist to sit in on the next session. I needed her story, not just fragments. I needed the why. And that's when she began. Not with words, but with charcoal. Ella brought in a sketchbook and flipped through a series of drawings. I'll never forget them. Each image bled pain. One showed her room in dim light, door cracked open, shadows moving across the floor. Another depicted a man, no face, hovering over a child curled in bed. She turned another page. This time, a woman stood in the hallway, eyes closed, hands over her ears. "Angela." I asked Ella if her mother knew. She nodded. And just like that, we had a second suspect. Angela hadn't just ignored Ella's cries, she had silenced her. Covered up for Greg. Let it happen. "You were a threat to his image," Ella wrote in another note. And mine ruined hers. Ella had tried to report it once, when she was 12. Told a school nurse. The nurse, bound by policy, called the parents. Angela intercepted the call. After that, Ella stopped speaking. Because she knew no one would listen. Until Greg slipped. Until that night. That final night, he came into her room again. But this time, Ella had locked the door. Greg kicked it in. Neighbors confirmed hearing a loud bang, but no one called the police. Greg pushed her. She hit her head against the dresser. When she woke, he was on top of her. That's when she reached for it. His belt. It was instinct. Not premeditation. A child fighting for her life. She pulled it around his throat and didn't let go. When Angela found them, Greg was slumped beside the bed, barely breathing. Ella had passed out. Instead of calling for help, Angela dragged Greg's body to the stairs. Staged the fall. Hid the belt. And warned Ella that if she ever spoke, she'd be taken away. Locked up. Labeled. The fear kept her mute. Until now. I pressed charges against Angela for obstruction, child endangerment, and conspiracy to tamper with evidence. Her face twisted with rage when the handcuffs clicked. Not because she was caught. Because she was exposed. Ella is now in protective custody, slowly learning to trust again. She hasn't spoken yet, not aloud. But last week, she did something else. She laughed. A small, quiet laugh. And in this job, Sometimes that's louder than any confession. I've always believed the silence after a case closes is the loudest part of all. But with Ella, the silence still speaks. In court, she sat beside her advocate, hands folded, calm. The prosecutor read her statement aloud, a statement she had written herself. I did not choose to be quiet. I was taught that silence kept me safe. No tears. No emotion. Just truth, poured onto paper like ink spilled from a cracked bottle. Angela stood across the courtroom, hollow-eyed and stone-faced. She didn't cry either. Maybe because deep down, she thought she did the right thing. Maybe because women like her have mastered the art of denial. Or maybe because guilt is heavier when carried quietly for years. The jury didn't take long. Greg's death was ruled self-defense. The evidence, Ella's trauma history, the bruises, the timeline, it all fit. Angela, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. She got 10 years, no parole. You might think justice feels like fireworks. But that day, it felt more like a window cracked open. Just a breath of air. A chance to start over. Ella was placed with a foster mother trained in trauma recovery. A quiet woman with a garden full of sunflowers and a therapy dog named Max. Ella took to him immediately. 3 weeks later, I visited her. She handed me a new sketchbook. On the last page, a girl stood in a field, hand outstretched, sun on her face. She had no mouth, but above her head, in gold letters, Ella had drawn one word. Free. That was the day I heard her speak. For the first time. She looked right at me and whispered, "Thank you." 2 words. Soft, cracked like old glass. But it was her voice. It was hers. You see, sometimes the ones who never speak carry the loudest truths. We're just too busy to notice. Or too scared to listen. So now, every time I get a case file about a quiet child, a mute teen, a girl who keeps to herself, I lean in closer. Because silence isn't always peace. Sometimes, it's a scream waiting to be heard. Ella now volunteers at a center for abused children. She still doesn't talk much. But her drawings line the walls, hopeful, colorful, loud. And I keep a copy of her final sketch in my desk drawer. A reminder that sometimes, solving a case isn't about catching a killer. It's about listening to the one who survived. Even when she never says a word.